Hi everyone, my name's Fiona and today I'll be talking about a programming language called Elixir. I'll start off with a brief intro about myself and then go into a bit of a background on Elixir, who created it, why they created it and what it is. And then we'll go into some basic types and concepts with some examples, and we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. So this is me. It's a bit of a background. I started off doing audio engineering. I then worked in corporate audiovisual at Macquarie Bank and moved into tech support there as well. I was there for 9 years, and after 9 years I wanted a bit of a career change and decided to do a web development immersive course at General Assembly. I completed that July last year and was lucky enough to get a job at a company called Expert 360. At Expert 360 we use Elixir as our primary back-end language, and on the front end we use JavaScript using the React framework. So Elixir, what is it, who created it, and why did they create it? This is Jose Valim. He created Elixir back in 2010 as part of a R&D project for the company he's still working for. He was working on, he's also a core member of the Ruby on Rails team. He was working on improving the performance of Rails, but was frustrated with how Rails dealt with concurrency. And I'll give an example of what concurrency is as well, to get a better understanding of the problem that he was trying to solve. So he started looking into other technologies and found a language called Erlang, which was developed in 1986 by Ericsson, which is a telecommunications company. And Erlang is used by a lot of people, companies like WhatsApp, other telecommunications company. The reason being is it's quite solid. It deals with concurrency and is highly fault tolerant. And hopefully with the example that I'm going to show you about concurrency, it'll give you an idea of how it works. Before that, there's also the Phoenix framework. So if any of you know Ruby, Phoenix is to Elixir what Rails is to Ruby. It's really quick to install. You can simply start a project after installing it. Let's just call this lowercase. And within a few minutes you'll have a up and running application. This might take a couple of minutes, so I have one prepared earlier as well, which I'll maybe bring up. Let's see how this goes.
It's not great.
Yeah, I've connected to my phone as a hotspot. I practiced a few times. Let's see how this goes. It should come up in a second. So yeah, you can get up and running using Elixir and Phoenix quite quickly. And here we go. So we'll just go into the project that was just created. And we just need to create our database. And just don't worry about the red. It means nothing. And cool, we're up and running. Hey, and so yeah, you've just got a basic app happening. Let's open up the code for this one, not the one that I prepared earlier, just in case. And let's go here. Hey, version 2. So within here, if you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, it's very much the same. You have templates and embedded Elixir files, and it live updates. So as soon as too many Ds. Save that, that'll update there. So yeah, it's for a beginner, it's quite easy to get into it. Moving on. Concurrency. So what I'll do now is just show an example of concurrency and how Elixir solves the problem of running multiple processes at the same time. This example is actually by one of the developers at Expert360 by Jack Marchant, so I'll give credit to him for this, and it's probably the best example that I've seen of explaining concurrency from Googling it quite a bit, because I had no idea. I'm like, what the hell is concurrency? So I'll bring up the example. So what I've got here is a Elixir file. You can tell by the .ex here. And what I've got open here is a terminal, and I'm running IEX, which is it's an active Elixir terminal where we can write Elixir code in. So what I'm going to run here is a synchronous process. And what this function is doing is looping through the numbers 1 to 100,000, and it's outputting that number. So as you can see, when I run that 100,000, we're waiting for that process to finish, and we can't run anything else when that's running. So what if there's an error in that synchronous process? What will happen? We'll soon find out. So if we're running a synchronous process, what will happen is, what I'm doing here is looping through numbers 1 to 10,000, and I've got a if-else statement here, and what we're doing is finding the even numbers, and if there's an even number, then we'll raise an error, otherwise let's output the number. So as you can see, the process stops on 2 being even, and the process has crashed. What you can do with Elixir is use the spawn function, and what this example here is again, we're mapping through the numbers 1 to 100,000, and each iteration, it's creating a new process, and that process is independent of the previous process. So what we should see is the numbers 1 to 100,000 printed out, but there may be some ordering, so they won't be all in order. So let's run that. And so what that means is, by outputting a number, it's not dependent on the previous number being outputted. And so hopefully if we look through here, we should see some misordering. So for example, here we've got 99954 being outputted before 99953. And that's because it's not relying on 53 being processed before it outputs the next number. And so let's see what happens when we do an async with an error included. And so if you remember the previous function, it stopped at 2, but what happens here is it allows the other processes to continue while the even numbers error. In a real-world situation, you would handle the errors a bit more elegantly, and you could do stuff with the errors and be like, hey, there's an error, let's try this instead. But yeah, hopefully that gives an idea of what concurrency is and what Elixir does. What I might do next is just get into some basic types. Elixir's similar to other languages. Yeah. So we've got integers, we've got strings, we've got booleans, we've got lists, like arrays. We also have things called tuples. So a tuple can be any combination of a number or a string. We've also got maps, which are basically the go-to for any key value object. So this is what a map looks like. And then there are things called structs. And what structs are have default values, and when the code is compiled, there are sort of checks to make sure that those default values, or values that aren't default, are not included. And the way that we create a struct, we'll get into modules in a couple of slides, but so what I'm doing here is creating a module called human, and we'll create a struct, and human has eyes and hair. And let's just end that. And so we've created a struct called human. So what we can do now is say let's create a variable for human1, and we can create a default human that has blue eyes and brown hair. We can also update the values in the struct. So we could say, hey, this human has brown eyes and we'll update the eye color, but the hair color will remain the same. If we try to introduce, hey, this human's got one leg. What I mean by the checking for when it's compiling is it'll error and it'll say, hey, key leg's not found in this struct. In the real world situations, a struct could be used for, say, a user profile. So a user profile will have certain values, certain keys that would that are from the schema in a database. So that would be one reason to use a struct. And we'll just move into modules, functions, and the pipe operator. So what a module is it basically contains a list of functions that are kind of in the same context of the other functions. And what that enables is you to be able to reuse those functions. Hence, Elixir being sort of like is a functional programming language. So what a module, when you create a module, within those within the module you'll have functions, and if you have another module and need to reuse those functions, you can import that module and have access to all the functions within that. I'll provide a example here. So we're going to have some fun with strings. That's what our module is called, and we've got a function called transform. I'll just sort of talk through the syntax here. So we define the module at the top, and then within we define the function here. If anyone uses Ruby, the syntax is similar. So we define the name of the function, and then we provide, is there an argument? And in Elixir we call that the arity of a function. In this case the arity is 1. If you have 2 arguments, the arity is 2, and so on. And so what we're doing here is grabbing the string, and we're using these things called pipe operators. And what the pipe operator does is it takes the value here and pipes it into our first function. After that function, the pipe operator will take the output of that and make that the first argument in the next function, and so forth. What I'll do is just run this function first just to see what the output is. What we're doing at the end here is we're mapping through a list which is created by this string.split, and we're using this syntax here, which is appending the word yes to the end. So if we run this function, okay. And we can pass any string. Oh, sorry, let me just recompile. Okay, let's try that again. So at the end there we get a list with the strings in uppercase with yes appended. So with Elixir there's a tool called io.inspect, and so what we can do is we can see what's happening at each point as the arguments are being passed down through the flow. And this is really beneficial to troubleshooting. We can add a label here, and we can say post uppercase, And let's just recompile and try that function again. And we now get an output here, which is really useful when troubleshooting, because you can actually debug at each step of the process. The last thing that I'll talk about now is pattern matching. And pattern matching is one of those foundational concepts of Elixir and functional programming. Let's go to wine country. So what I've got here is some examples of some functions with pattern matching. I'll start off with a very simple pattern match. What's happening with Elixir, it evaluates the right to the left. So to look at the value on the right and bind it to a value on the left. One of the things you can do is pattern match on the shape of the data. So in this case, we've got a list on the right, and we're pattern matching it and binding those values to each of those variables, and so forth. So if you had a tuple on the left, seeing the shape of the data is different, you'll get a handy error saying no match of right-hand side value 1, 2, 3. So how is this helpful? So in Elixir, there is an if-else statement, but you can only have two conditions. So you can go if this or else that, and that's it. You also have things called condition statements. So if you have more than two conditions, you can use a condition statement, but it's not as readable. So what we can do is we can use pattern matching for our conditional statements. Just looking at the time, I might just use this example here. What this is doing, it can be called function overloading or multi-clause function matching. And what we're doing here is trying to work out what wine goes with a certain type of food. So let's run this function here. And today I'm in the mood for oysters. And so what's going to happen here is I'm calling choose wine, and I'm using pattern matching to match on part of that map. And in this case, we're using oysters, and we should expect it to output Riesling goes well with that. Tuples are generally the return from a function. It's idiomatic of Elixir to have, say, an OK and then the response, or an error and then the response. And so what happens here is, what we're matching on is oysters and lobster, but say we put something in there that's like pizza. This is kind of the catch-all here. So if you kind of look at this as like, hey, if this, else this, you can keep on going on, and then at the end it's like, hey, it's an error and it's a catch-all. It's also really good for error handling. So say we use that pipe operator to pipe it into the next function. And we can then handle that error in any way that we want to. Just looking at the time, I might just go into some resources. A really good one is Stephen Grider. He's got a really good course on Udemy, and it covers both Elixir and Phoenix. The Elixir docs are really good. The community, although small, is super helpful. And then also there's Elixir Sydney, which is the first Wednesday of every month. So come along to that. Our company Expert 360 hosts it every now and then. So if you want to learn more, it's as I said, it's like a really, really friendly community to come along to. So yeah, any questions? Yeah.
That the first page, the example that you showed us on the website, where it reloaded.
Yeah.
What was doing the reloading there?
I don't know. I'll get back to you on that. the engine. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Hey.
So, what benefit do you guys get out of using Elixir over something like, like Rails, for example?
Yeah. So it's basically it's fault tolerant, so it'll crash. So basically, when you write code, any errors in your code will happen at compile time, and you can handle them there. It's the performance of it is better than Rails, and yeah, the main thing that Jose created it for was concurrency, to have multiple processes running at the same time. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of concurrency, is there, from your personal opinion, a better reason to choose something like Elixir versus another language that tackles concurrency like Go or anything like that?
Yeah, look, I don't know. It's a preference. I'm not that skilled. I've been doing this for about a year, so yeah, I don't really have an opinion on it. Yeah, I don't know Go, but I know there are developers at Expert 360 that love Go, and they go on about it. Cool.
Thank you so much, Fiona.